Now, Chapter 12 is about the circulatory system, and as usual, we have the topics that we're going to be talking about. And this first video is going to give an overview about the system. So the circulatory system is really the heart, blood, and blood vessels. So the pump of the system is the heart, and then the blood vessels or the vascular system, and sometimes the system is called the cardiovascular system. These are basically interconnected tubes that are all in contact with each other. There should be no leakage, or that would be considered bleeding. And then there's the actual blood, which is remember, that was the only fluid kind of connective tissue we had in the body, and that would be pumped by the heart throughout the blood vessels. The cardiovascular system can be affected by the endocrine system, so by hormones, by the nervous system, and by the urinary system. So this is something that is kind of unique in regards to the circulatory system because, again, keeping the amount of blood volume, changes in blood pressure. The urinary system, when we get to that system, as you'll see, they kind of coordinate that together. Now, what is blood actually made of? If you take a sample of blood and you put it into a centrifuge, which is basically kind of like works kind of like a dryer. It spins the blood around very fast. That would lead to the separation of the blood components. You'll find that the plasma will kind of float all the way up to the top, while the heavier cells, what are known as the formed elements, in particular the red blood cells, are all going to deposit and precipitate on the bottom. You'll see that plasma makes about 55% of blood. Okay, so 55% of blood is made out of plasma. About 45% of blood is made out of erythrocytes or red blood cells. And in the middle, there's like about 1% of white blood cells and platelets, and that is known as the buffy coat. Now let's introduce what plasma is. Plasma is mainly water. Okay, so as you can see that the majority, about more than 90% of plasma is water. And we have all of that water in order for things to swim and dissolve in that water so that we can distribute them to the rest of the body. So you'll find you'll find there gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. You can find waste products like urea. You'll find hormones, vitamins, plasma proteins, like albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. All of these are things that are being transported by that 90% water. And as we know that, blood is responsible for to make blood clots when needed. And when we use the cells that we need for blood clotting, which are basically fibrinogen and plasma proteins, whatever fluid is remaining behind, or whatever fluid remains behind, is known as serum. And I'm kind of introducing the concept of serum at this point because here we're talking about what the composition of plasma is. So when we get to blood clotting, we already know what serum is. So serum is the exact same thing as plasma, minus everything we use to make that blood clot. So again, minus fibrinogen and plasma proteins. And if you're not really familiar with what serum looks like, think about getting a scab, and then you have like this water kind of oozing out of the scab. That's what serum is. We all know that all of our blood cells are made by the bone marrow. Okay, they all start off with what is known as a multipotent, uncommitted, hematopoietic stem cell. So what on earth does that mean? It is a stem cell that is going to be making blood cells. So hematopoietic means we'll make blood cells. Uncommitted, so we don't know which blood cell we'll end up having. And it's multipotent, meaning that it can make every single kind of blood cell that we have. So it is a multipotent, uncommitted, hematopoietic stem cell. Now that stem cell is going to divide by mitosis and differentiate. Differentiate means to grow up a little bit and become more specialized. It can either become a lymphoid stem cell, which eventually will give us lymphocytes, so either T or B lymphocytes, both of which are one of the 5 kinds of white blood cells. Or that uncommitted stem cell will differentiate to become what is known as a myeloid stem cell. And a myeloid stem cell can become either a red blood cell or platelets or the remaining 4 kinds of white blood cells, which are monocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, or basophils. Okay, so now I would like to get to a point where we kind of introduce a brief introduction to each of these cells. So our red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, and you want to be familiar with both terms, they start off as being kind of like these baby RBCs. Those are known as reticulocytes. Reticulocytes should be in the bone marrow, but some of these reticulocytes appear in our blood smears. Okay, only a very small amount, a very few amount of these reticulocytes appear. If they appear in larger quantities, that would be known as reticulocytosis. And that means that the bone marrow is just making these RBCs way too fast. The factor is going way too fast and just kind of sending them off into the bloodstream before they mature to become this mature RBC. Red blood cells do not have a nuclei. Okay, so, we'll talk about that more when we get to the full discussion of RBCs. Now, platelets is another one of those blood cells that do not have a nucleus, so they are anucleated, and they're really not cells in the way that we understand what a cell is. They are fragments, cytoplasmic fragments of this bigger cell known as the megakaryocyte. So that, it's kind of like pinching off small pieces of the cytoplasm of the megakaryocyte will give us these platelets. Now, for all of the different kinds of white blood cells, remember we have 5 types. One of them is known as the monocyte. Monocyte is a very aggressive phagocytic cell. Monocytes are found in the bloodstream. When they leave the blood and go into the tissue, they become macrophages. So a monocyte and macrophage are pretty much the same cell. Monocytes are in the bloodstream, though, and macrophages are in the tissue, and both of them are phagocytic cells. These 3 in the middle, those 3 together are known as granulocytes because they have these little cytoplasmic granules, and according to the color of those granules, we've named the cells. So a neutrophil has neutral granules. Okay, they're kind of like purplish in color. Eosinophils have red granules, so eosine means red, and basophils have blue granules. Okay, so again, all of 3 of these together are known as granulocytes. Now for the last kind of white blood cells, those are your lymphocytes. We have 2 kinds. There's either T or B lymphocytes, and we'll talk about them in more detail when we get there. The monocytes and lymphocytes, both of them, when you look under a light microscope, which is that normal microscope that we kind of have on campus, you cannot see granules under in their cytoplasm. So they are known as agranulocytes, A as in no granulocytes.